What are you made of? Or he's made of sterner stuff. These little sayings that we use in our everyday life that kind of hint towards a truth that we know, that what we are made of affects the way that we behave. And actually, as humans, if we want to understand why we do what we do, then knowing what we're made of really matters. Genesis 2:7 tells us that God formed man from the dust of the ground, afar, dust. And knowing that is really important, because first of all, we find that God formed man. That matters. Because while we are made in the image of God, this tells us that we are not the same as God. We are like him, but not the same as him, because we were formed. We didn't exist before we were formed. So God is eternal, pre-existent. He has no start, no end. But humans, we have these limitations around our life. We have a beginning, and Genesis 3 will go on to tell us we have an end. From dust you were taken, to dust you'll return. We have a start, we have a finish. There was a time before we existed and a time when we were formed. And so while we bear the image of God, we are not divine, we are human. We were formed. And that means while God is limitless, we as humans, built into our very framework, have limitations. We exist within these limitations, these parameters of our start and our end. We are limited beings by our very nature. We were formed, so we are limited. But it says in Genesis 2:7 that we were formed from dust, which is really interesting, because actually in other places in Genesis we hear God just speak things into existence, like let there be light, and there was light. No reference to what he uses for material to create those things. But when it comes to making humanity, it's very clear that God takes something that already exists, dust from the earth. He takes it, this afar, this dust, and he forms us from it. That tells us something really important about our makeup as well. Because we are, by our very nature, dependent. We are dependent on the earth on which we exist. We don't just occupy it, we are dependent on it. Our very existence depended on material taken from the earth. We are dependent human beings, and we still are. We're still dependent on the earth. We still need the earth to give us what we need to survive. If the earth doesn't produce food, we die. If the skies don't produce water, we die. If we don't have oxygen, we die. We are dependent beings, dependent on our environment. We are not like God. We are like him, but we are not the same as him, because God is not dependent. He is self-sustaining. He doesn't need anything outside of himself to exist, but we do. So we are limited because we were formed, and we are dependent because we were formed from dust. We are not divine. The problem comes when we try to operate outside of our makeup, when we fight our very DNA, when we push back against the materials from which we were made and the way which we were made. You see, humans oftentimes don't like the fact that we are limited and we are dependent. We push back against both those things. We don't want to be limited. We like to think that we are limitless in our energy. We are offended when we're tired, or when we need to rest, or when we don't have the energy to do something else. We don't want to be limited in our energy. We also don't want to be limited in our capacity. We want to be able to do all things. We want to be able to say yes to everything. We want to be all things to all people. And we are annoyed when we hit our capacity. When we meet the boundaries of what we're capable of, it really offends us. We don't want to be limited. We want to be divine, not human. And any time that we try to operate outside of our own limitations, we are trying to be God, and we are not. We don't want to be limited. We also don't want to be dependent. We want to be strong, independent humans. In fact, in the West, independence is one of the highest ideals that we have. We raise our children to be independent. We want them to be independent humans. We want to be self-sufficient. We want to be able to manage on our own, to cope all by myself. And yet, our makeup tells us that this is us fighting against who we are and trying to be the divine, because the divine God is the only one who's truly independent, who has no needs. We are offended when we have needs that we can't meet ourselves. We don't like to ask for help because we're trying to be God and we're not happy to be human. We don't want to be limited. We don't want to be dependent. And worse still, perhaps, is we don't like that in other people either. The people with which we do community with. We don't want them to be human either. We don't want them to be limited. We're offended when the people we work with, or maybe work for, or maybe people who work for us, meet their limitations. When they can't do something, when they are exhausted at the end of themselves, when they have to say no, when they're limited, and we push back against other people's limitations. We don't like their boundaries. We don't like when people say, no, I can't, because we don't want people to be limited. And we don't want people to be dependent. We hate needy people, especially in Northern Ireland. We're like, just suck it up and get on with life. We hate when people have needs. We don't want people to be needy. And actually, what it says is we want people to be like God, not human. And we can't be, because we were formed from the dust. We are limited and dependent. And the problem is when we put that kind of expectation, an expectation of the divine, on humans, humans crack under that weight. You will crack under that weight. If you continually expect yourself to be limitless and you refuse to operate with inside of your own physical limitations, you will crack under that weight. If you expect that of other people, your relationships will crack under that weight. And I tell you that that person that you're in relationship with, they are not your all-sufficient one. They can't be. That's God's job. Can I tell you that your friend cannot be your ever-present help in time of trouble? And if you're really offended because of that one time they couldn't show up for you, then you were expecting them to be divine, and they are human. They are not your ever-present help in time of trouble. You expect that spouse of yours to love you without fault or without fracture, to give you perfect love. You're expecting that person to operate like God, to be God. Because no human has that capacity within them. Our love will always be fractured and faulty. And if you expect that person to love you without failure, your relationship will crack underneath that weight. What we need is to give ourselves permission and the people around us permission to operate within the boundaries of their own insufficiency. Because we are human. We were formed from the dust. But dust isn't the end of the story, thankfully, because in Genesis 2:7, it goes on to say that God formed the man from the dust, but then he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Oh, what an image. And it gives us this equation to work with when we think about our makeup. Dust plus breath equals life. Dust plus breath equals life. God gets down in the dust that he has formed and he breathes into the nostrils. I want you to think about that image for a bit. I want you to think about the proximity that requires. I don't know if you've ever seen anyone do CPR, maybe on TV or, maybe even in real life. And you don't do that from a distance. If you're going to breathe into somebody, the breath of life, that is extremely close work. And we have this beautiful image of God bending down in the dust, this extremely close work, and breathing into us the breath of life. Dust plus his divine breath equals life, and that's still the equation. And proximity, closeness to him, is still the means by which we sustain life. If you and I want life, like John 10 talks about, like abundant life spiritually, emotionally, physically. If we want abundant life, what that's going to require is us to be really, really close to God, because we need to be close to him if we want his breath to infiltrate our dust and bring it to life. And the problem is we're just so used to walking away. Like, we walk away from him all the time. In Genesis 3, we see what happens. The people turn away from him. They come out from under his authority. They walk away. And in Genesis 3, we find this verse that says, from dust you were taken, and now to dust you'll return. Like, life cannot be sustained away from me. Living fully at a distance from God, that's impossible. Because every time we walk away from him, we die a little. And our dust just goes back to dust. And so as people who want to live fully, we have to ruthlessly eliminate from our lives anything that causes us separation from him, anything that distracts us, anything that disorientates us, anything that takes us away, even for a minute, that's got to go. Because this proximity is essential to his breath infiltrating our dust and bringing us to life. Dust plus breath still equals life. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of dust on display these days. A lot of human weakness, a lot of frailty, and actually systems that have been built on frail human dust and therefore are starting to crack and give way. And it's easy to lose heart in the middle of it all, to look at all of the human dust, to look at all of the human weakness and brokenness and frailty and think, how do we even begin to build a good society again in the middle of all of this dust? But we're not the first people to ask those questions. Because in Nehemiah's day, this incredible guy in the Old Testament, those questions were being asked too. Nehemiah is tasked with going back to Jerusalem, God's beautiful city that has been wrecked and ravaged and lies in ruins. And he's tasked with getting the people of God to rebuild the walls that are ruined. And there comes this point in Nehemiah 4:2 where all of the people who are opposing them, the opposition, they start to mock and they say, how can these people call these stones, this rubble, back to life? How can they build stones from the dust? It's actually the same word we see in Genesis 2, afar. How can you build in dust? And actually the labourers themselves, it says of them in Nehemiah 4:10 that they were starting to lose their strength because they didn't know how to build in the middle of all of the dust. And we don't know how to build in the middle of all of the dust. How do we not lose heart? Well, I think it's important to remember where we started. That God, whenever he formed this incredible humanity, chose dust. He chose the dust as his starting point. And when we remember that, we realise that dust, human weakness and frailty, this dust, this is not a blockage to God. Dust is not a blockage, it's an opportunity. For God, dust is an opportunity because you see, dust plus breath still equals life. And the problem is it's really easy to sit down in the middle of the dust or to abandon the dust, to walk out of it, to say it cannot, there's nothing good can come of this dust, this death. There's nothing good can come of the dust of the relationship that I'm in, the dust of the town that I live in, the dust of our community, the dust of our nation. There's nothing good can come from any of that. It's really easy to sit down in the dust. But you know what? You see, if Nehemiah had sat down in the dust, if the people had sat down in the dust, they never would have got to their Nehemiah 12 moment where the walls are rebuilt, and they're rebuilt in spite of all of the opposition, in spite of all of the rubble, and in spite of the fact that it should have taken much longer than it did. There's a supernatural energy, the supernatural favour. The walls are rebuilt, and in Nehemiah 12 they all celebrate the fact that this should never have happened. They look at the walls that have built and they said, how on earth did we build this out of dust? I'm really glad that Nehemiah didn't sit down in the dust. And I want to say to you today, please don't sit down in the dust. I know the world is full of human weakness. And I know everywhere that you turn right now, you see dust. But please don't sit down in the dust. Now is not the time for the church to sit down in the dust and to call it a day and to say this is hopeless, because we know the maths. And the maths tell us that dust plus divine breath still equals life. And even though our nation might look like a lot of dust, our world might look like a lot of dust, a lot of weakness, a lot of human frailty, that when God gets involved with that dust, there is still the possibility of life. And instead of sitting down, maybe it's time that you and I, who believe in the breath of God, begin to call for that breath to come back and to infiltrate the dust in which we walk. Maybe it's time for us to get our hopes up again, to begin to expect God to bring some things back to life. Because the math still holds. Dust plus breath still equals life. And so our story is not hopeless. It's not hopeless. Our story, your story is not hopeless. Our story is not hopeless because we know the maths. But what we do need is we need to remember our makeup. We need to remember that humans are made from dust, and we need to make space for the dust. We need to not expect too much from people. Make space for the dust. But we also need to make space for the breath. And we need to not expect too little from God. Don't expect too much from people, but please don't expect too little from God, because the maths still holds. Dust plus breath still equals life.